Hello everyone, today we talk about the Indo-European ancestry of the Romano-Italic people. This is not the first time we talk about this. Last year I made a video response to a Metatron's video regarding the fairness of the Romano-Italic people. The reason I call them like this will be readily evident. There was an approximation about the Romans, and this is an important distinction because this video is fundamentally based on this. I mean, not on the video nor on that topic in particular, but on the affirmation, let's say the reaffirmation of what is actually notorious historically, genetically, archaeologically, and more. That is to say, the Italic peoples, among which were the Latins themselves, were essentially the descendants of a relatively light racial type that originated from Central Europe, at least in the moment of the migration into Italy, and that we know actually very few about. This is true, as you know, for that migration era in particular, because, as I always say, archaeologically there are not tags, but of course we see in the Italian settlement and sort of through genetic studies and all the comparative evidence that we have macroscopically on the topic, what we very well know, not just the fact that the majority of the central northern Italian peninsula was inhabited by Celto-Italic peoples, as a matter of fact. And also the south had a pretty strong component of Italics especially. Then you have other groups, you have the Illyrians as well. Speaking of the Indo-Europeans, only like there were of course the Greeks as well, but more of this later. I have to explain why I'm making this video in the first place, because this is one of those topics that are going to be, and I actually don't care too much about it, but people who subscribe to my channel may not be absolutely used to my kind of work, nor about the many videos that I've made, generally speaking, on the topic, and more, especially from a military and religious point of view, like the Indo-European legacy in Roman cultures, the central one and the constitutive really of the Roman Empire, and that's why I was stressing also the centrality of the Romano-Italic people into this, because this video is not just a chance to talk more in general about the say phenotypical, if anything, so corresponding to an important degree of genotypical Indo-European component, but also to among these populations, but also to reflect a bit more on what the empire really was constitutively. And we've seen it. I made literally hundreds of videos about Roman history, and people still don't know that I even exist, mostly because the channel is small and legitimately YouTube hasn't given you a chance, if not very late in time. Most of my subscribers are just here from the last year or so, even though I'm here for much longer. And I was really impressed in general. Like, I was already aware of this, but it was interesting for me to observe it through the aforementioned video I made last year. How many actual Western people, Western adults, I mean people who use YouTube and so interact also from this general through this general interest in history and the Romans and ancestries and so on, to be fundamentally unaware. I can show you some literal comments of people who said, "Oh wow, I didn't know that the blonde hair, or even red hair, blue eyes were much of a thing in, I don't know, ancient Italy." Right? And I was actually shocked to hear that, but frankly I'm not surprised, because of all a set of reasons that frankly I want to bypass for this video. This could be just the beginning of a much broader discussion, also at the beginning of actually a series about the individual Italic peoples, or also broadly speaking the Italian ones, because there are some that we do not know whether they're Italic or not. Just recently made a video, for example, about the Ligurians that turns out they were actually Italic, even though we don't have, at least for a while, there was some skepticism. But I will not enter into the broader merit of objectively why there is a sort of deliberate and sort of maybe actually a subconscious attitude deriving from very specific historical, cultural, even religious reasons to fundamentally annihilate the idea that essentially Italy had a strong Italic, in this sense, Celto-Italic actually, Indo-European background, plus again all the other, say, Indo-European minorities. That was, however, the actual bulk. Just yesterday we were talking about the boy, and that basically this would go as far as literally having statements like the one that I made before. Now, the reason why, again, I make this video is simple but complex at the same time, because the point is showing, as I've done already last year, all the major evidence that we have explicitly from Romano-Italic literature and art, and let's say at least art for what I uploaded in the images, and more, regarding what we also well know by looking at the modern Italian genetic background, regarding, of course, the existence of this robust, actually prevalent Indo-European component, and of course the consequent presence of fair hair, blue eyes, that of course are not prevalent, but they're also not fundamentally like something rare or unnatural as it was defined by someone. Like, this was actually what Metatron said in that video. And it wasn't much of an aggressive response to him or anything, that, let's say, I don't make it a matter of personal issues, but I thought that, especially from a character like him that is very much into this sort of race baiting, which is perfectly fine as long as you, of course, explain things correctly, to use such words that frankly impressed me, and that as a consequence prompted me to make this kind of video. And I would like to stress also that this video, of course, is in thematic continuity with the aforementioned one, but it is not a continuation of the same point, right? However, that video was also framed within another broader issue. Essentially, the positive side of Metatron's work is that he spent a lot of time debunking the sort of black supremacist stuff around, and it came a point which he probably felt like, okay, I'm pushing very much from that side, let's give a blow to the other one. And so regarding the claim that the Romans would have been essentially a Nordic people, which is a statement that objectively already by itself doesn't hold water, because you can argue that even in a strictly, what is Nordic in the first place, right? It's just a certain degree of frequency of blue and eyes and, say, blonde or red hair. No people prevalently has that on Earth, and say on a national basis, of course. And this is the not likely was the case, in fact, much also in the past, even though there was surely some darkening also of Northern Europe over time. This is something I'm not really even interested in discussing per se, right? So the other problem is, what is a Roman? And that's why, now you understand, I stress here the Romano-Italic centrality, because there, and this was just like the antifact, let's say, but the broader point is that there is a say despicable trend in, say, pop history, deriving mostly again from very precise background, very precise ideologies, etc., which is essentially the prevalent way, even though in a sort of softer fashion, Roman history was presented to us in many ways, concerning the idea of essentially mixedly homogeneous, meaning, say, a completely blended sort of multiculturally, multi-ethnically speaking empire, right? Some sort of place where race did not matter, in which there was not actually a very specific national centrality in the empire, which is actually what the thing eventually turns to be historically, like in any context, one people that eventually rules over the others. Many people as I was saying in the beginning, seems to have probably been removed surgically. The idea that was specificity in the, if not in the Italicness, considering all the, say, what essentially Italy became historically, if you want, the Italian, meaning not just in Italic peoples, were others that were of non-Italic origin. We've seen the Celts, we've seen other more mysterious peoples like the Etruscans, but more or less they were all sort of Villanovian plus Indo-European, and there was a much greater homogeneity actually in the Italian ethnic background already at the time. It was also the one that remained up to this very day, because aside from some significant minorities of Germanic injection during the migration era, there's essentially not been any other big sort of external influence, if not probably during the early Roman Empire, considering the openness, but only at a actually demographically contained level, because it mostly revolved around the cities. Yes, there was a lot of slavery involved, but this also came from some sort of equilibrated background. It wasn't unique to Italy, and we know very well that in pre-industrial societies there's not such a thing like, I don't know, ethnic replacements, whatever, because probably the labor force, the manpower, even the intense, for example, Roman colonization itself of the West that turned linguistically Iberia, Gaul into Romance countries is something that still has nothing to do with the change of what was the genetic, the essential genetic background of those regions. So this is debatable, of course, to another extent for those countries that were more depopulated, specifically Central, but especially Eastern Europe, so that both because of this scarcity of population compared to the West and the waves coming from the East, right, things got sort of more modified, and in fact, national identities, especially in certain areas in the Balkans, are sort of much more complicated. And it's not even to that enormous degree that, especially the nationalistic philosophies would like to make you believe today in a way or another. This is also, again, I've made so many videos about those areas, especially during the Middle Ages, in the ethnogenesis of so many peoples. I have no interest in wasting time talking about that, given the importance of today's theme. This perspective, of course, of a sort of nationless, raceless, even languageless to a degree, meaning that, yes, you could speak Latin, but you could be anyone, basically, also in private, is the almost forced perspective that we have been provided by a certain type of storytelling that didn't literally tell us, of course, that the Romans were, sort of, the Romano-Italic peoples were replaced, or they were all mixed, or whatever. Some people believe that, but they are out of, they're not definitely in an academic context, nor most people, I think, in pop culture, I hope, believe such a thing. However, there was also another level of, let's say, a byproduct of this concept that instead seems to be quite popular, and it seems that also prominent YouTubers engage into this. That is the narrative that the Romans fundamentally had and the Romano-Italic imperial establishment, imperial elite, and the Roman nobility at large did not care essentially about race. There was this purely meritocratic system for which, your origins, your look, your sort of spiritual and bodily dimension did not matter. The reason why this perspective is being enforced is, again, mostly deriving from the idea of how the Romans would eventually be capable of expanding their own citizenship for reasons of government. I mean, in many ways, the reason why there was an empire in the first place is that there were all these, aside from the mystical religious reasons why this happened in the first place, that we also discussed in other videos, there was a matter of practical governability. There were people that, as we've seen, had to fight for Rome, had to win a place within the system, but we somehow underestimate how tied to their local milieu that they actually were. Right? Surely lots of people moved around the empire. The Rome in particular was sort of cosmopolitic, but we observe that mostly in function of the higher spheres of the elites, and in a process that was actually, and for centuries on end, very tormented, because the Romano-Italic senators were not actually happy at all to extend the Roman citizenship to other nations. And this happened, if you want, yes, the Romans in this were relatively generous. Like the Greeks would have never done this, and that's why they fundamentally wouldn't have a lasting empire in the same Roman fashion, also in a way that could literally mold and allowing for... The Romans had a very different mentality from the Greeks and lifestyle and background, whatever. And again, I would like to digress on that, but this is, again, not today's topic either. But if you look at it in other ways, you realize that the ways this citizenship was dispensed was also very, very, let's say, gradual, and also in return for an enormous effort, right? Military service, civil service, but in general, like a Romanization that was truly, until the 3rd century AD, stemming from the Romano-Italic imperial rule over other nations all around the Mediterranean and Europe. And that remained quite... I made lots of videos about the 3rd century that show this, also recently about Trebonianus Gallus, for example, but there is the Italian revolt against Maximinus the Thracian. There are lots of notorious and massive macroscopic historiographical stuff. This is not a mystery, right? I realize that pop culture is mostly designed for people that do not have a historical, academic, general educational background about these topics, but it's not like a person... Like I don't give my credentials, my identity to YouTube, or say at least publicly, in the sense that you have to believe what I say just because. This is just... I know it personally, like what people would call mainstream, a terrible term that I never use myself, but just to make you understand quickly, we're talking about history that has been written and studied for centuries on these specific themes, not in a way that there are some strange hypotheses, but they are some of the most important historiographical pillars of what it means to study the ABC of Roman history. Like if you study a Roman history manual, that's what you get. Now, today's video is designed exactly in this function. Like we will look first of all at the general ethnographic background of Italy and the Indo-European invasions. We will talk about all, essentially, not all, because there is actually much more than this, but say the most significant, poignant evidence of Romano-Italic peoples in the first, we're talking here the so-called Republic and early Imperial times at the latest, references to the most evident sort of fair phenotypical reference to the Romano-Italic people themselves, meaning how often things like blonde hair, even red hair, blue eyes recur, and how this was actually conceived in line with the traditional and very sort of genetically fixated, actually, understanding of world, of peoples, of races, all in function from this broader degeneration from the divine unity that the Imperial Catholic Rome brought back together, and say also, as you know, giving way to the Christian Catholic point of view. And then we will make a final consideration on the frequency of specific information regarding the emperors. That is the one that in the general internet chit-chat is referred to as, look, this emperor was blonde or had blue eyes, whatever. And this thing especially circulated from some works by, say, surely like some sort of Indo-European mystics with some specific racial bias that in the past was debunked, but that still shows that actually from a merely statistical point of view, if we ever know the few cases what kind of look the Roman emperors had for this the phase of Italic dominance, they, surprise, surprise, are sort of dark blonde, gray, blue-eyed, something like that. So it is a lot of stuff. I would like to have provided sort of even a more effective introduction. I had been waiting a lot to make this video just to prepare for a moment, especially of the year, that I get sort of more views and can be hopefully help to disseminate further this content. But this is where it begins, like challenging the general. I don't know. I don't even want to again digress on why people have this sort of incredibly, say, idea of the darkness of the Romans in general. Like, of course, this is relative to mostly peoples like the Celts, that we should also see who they actually were, because that's the same problem. They had been conquered by essentially Aryan invaders, but these had sort of diluted themselves. You have to really think that the Gauls at large were prevalently blonde or red-haired, not even close to that. The Germans themselves, and so within Europe, also from the 19th century, from a general standpoint of social Darwinism, a lot of sort of racial grading was given, and it turns out that the Italians were understood among at least the Westerners, because that was mostly the race between like the main Western nations, so not even considering others within the same Europe, like, I don't know, Greece or Spain or Portugal. They're actually darker countries than Italy, are not fitting this sort of competition. There is also, as you know, a disproportionate amount of Southern Italian immigrants in U.S. history that brought to the idea that that's basically what the Italian is. Whereas, in fact, looking at the broader Mediterranean reality, not just Italy is basically the fair country, except for maybe France, of course, but in the sense that Southern Gaul is actually not necessarily that fairer than central northern Italy, plus we're more or less basically the same level, or possibly even more for Italy, because of all these Indo-European invaders, which is sort of underrated in the broader historical perspective. And to the point of, I don't know, you open an Osprey publishing book and you see some Anglo-Saxon drawers from the early 2000s depicting Romans as uniformly black-haired people with dark complexion in a completely uniform way. That's actually shocking. Like there is much actually. There's been a very a steep increase, I would say, in the sensitivity regarding to this issue. Osprey, for example, today makes sort of much more reliable, at least imagery on this regard. But it's still a thing, right? Aside from the fact, of course, like in today's times, we have much sort of bigger racial issues to observe in the world. This one between sort of Western Europeans doesn't seem that important. I personally think it's incredibly as deeply ingrained into specific cultures that also contribute to the general problem of even politically, like say, just even becoming fakely, at least just publicly, apparently, allegedly blind to race, whereas actually the ancients were incredibly open about this, as we will see now by the same Romano-Italic sources depicting themselves and their heroes and their ancestors, which I've never found a sort of dignified list on YouTube being actually set out. So as we were saying before, we have pretty extensive evidence also just about, for example, the Italian anthropological surveys on the peninsula. There was a military one carried out by Levi in the Italian army on the classes of 1867, 1870. So this is also a moment, this naturally we are at the end of the 19th century, so this were likely, I think, from the surveys from 1896 or 97, I don't remember. So we're also interestingly talking about an Italy that had just been unified and that in many ways was, backwards in terms of industrialization. And so the great movement of masses, internal migration, especially starting from the 50s, the 60s, but also partly, of course, in the previous centuries, from north to south, etc., had not sort of blurred the millennia-old genetic certification in some parts of the peninsula. And essentially, from this map that was drawn on the basis of such data, we're talking something, I think, like almost 300,000 pictures, right, that were indicated how many people with blonde hair, or fair hair in general, and blue eyes, were ranked. There were two main areas of such fairness. One was located in northern Italy, in particular in western Lombardy, and this was rightfully in general associated with the Longobard migration. Actually, there are also other parts. Here I'm really simplifying because that's the reason why we should actually make more videos on this topic. But as you know, lots of Germanic peoples settled during this main, essentially the Ostrogothic and Longobard migration. Also were the largest during the migration era, except Italy was very populated, especially compared to other parts of northern Europe where the Germanic impact was greater. Nevertheless, there had been Celts in those areas before the Roman conquest that, of course, did not erase at all, as we were saying, that ethnic substratum. However, you find also, more interestingly, another area with particularly fair phenotype. It's actually less pronounced in this sense, but it runs quite clearly along the arc of the Apennines on the Adriatic side of the watershed, which was attributed to the earliest Italic migrations. The most interesting thing about this strong, fair complexion, and I would like to stress it because it's a part of Italy that is generally underrepresented enormously. Like, it's not that people in general are particularly interested in history, even less they're precise, that they stop to the national side of the story. But there is this area of central and especially eastern Italy. We're talking Umbria, parts of Tuscany, especially the hinterland ones, the Abruzzi, and the northern and eastern part of southern Italy, specifically Molise, Benevent, northern Apulia, and the northern and eastern parts of Lucania. So we're actually talking about pretty southern places, displaying such high fair characteristics. And these areas correspond, famously enough, mostly to the Osco-Sabellic group of the Italic peoples as a branch of the Indo-European ones. We also have dispersed offshoots of this fair type in other areas of the Italian peninsula and also in Sicily, right? Essentially, as we'll see now, the migrations went pretty far and wide. We always underestimate how sparse, right? How, say, the settlement dynamics were sort of much different from our general understanding, in fact, of simply like a 19th century idea of a nation state, especially in antiquity, right? And we have to think, of course, that such groups would eventually start irradiating from this area. It's a bit like when you look at the Celts of the Hallstatt or Latin period. They were essentially settled around the Alps, right, in a relatively contained place. This had already migrated from there, from the east, from the Caucasus, historically throughout also an important amount of time. But from there, they began to expand in waves, and much of this dynamic is, of course, connected to the same reasons that you see in places with scarcer resources. Look at the Viking era with Scandinavia, etc. So different changes may be climatic, but humans actually do much more interesting things on their own than whichever external factor prompts them to began to send people out there, war bands. The Italics specifically had the famous Ver Sacrum, the sacred spring, that corresponded to the typical Indo-European system of settlement, of conquest of other land, of crushing of enemies, of selection properly of the elite, and the propagation of such genes further. This area, as I was saying before, is not really represented. I don't know how many people actually even travel around this place, so have a proportional idea of how, in fact, frequent it is to meet normally. Like, and here we should also try to define what it means, probably blonde hair, because one thing is saying, okay, the person is almost albino, and another thing is saying maybe what people call dark blonde, and or still blue eyes, etc. We're talking about distinctly and sort of very white people, not what you would imagine like the average typical Italian darker type. And this actually did constitute, in fact, a very important part of the same Italian demographic background already from the time. And since these areas are sort of less developed and more or less the local communities, yes, immigrated as well, but remained relatively less untouched from the external, you can actually appreciate how original these are. There's a very strong, again, Celto-Italic background in all this. Today we talk just about the Italics, but never underestimate the Celts. When people think about the Romans, the Romans that invaded Gaul had largely also, considering that were recruited from Cisalpine Gaul, Celtic ancestry. And the general stereotype of the darker people, the Mediterranean sort of shorter kind of, it is, say, true in relation to other peoples, but it's not like it's a categorically rigid separation for which you could tell simply people from another in that way. I mean, it doesn't even happen today. It's really frequent to encounter like substantially Nordic types and or pretty sort of also tall people in general. I don't know, again, why the Italian background was so stereotyped. Again, a lot of that have to do with the great migrations of the 19th to the 20th century, especially from southern Italy, but not even in that case. Like, southern Italy has notoriously, among its types, very typically, blonde, blue-eyed people. This is very true for the Sicilians, are much fairer than the Calabrians, or even more than the Sardinians. The Sardinians probably have nothing to do with Italy in a say, genetic sense. They're studied in a completely different way. Anthropologically, and of course there were other peoples, like in that case the Normans in Sicily, that however were not enormously many in general compared to the rest of the population. Remember always this, that Italy was and still is actually the single most densely populated country in Europe in interest of territory probably, and historically whoever migrated there was always a staunch minority to some degree. And the fact that we're talking instead about this robust amount of Indo-European ancestors for the Romano-Italic population is exactly this Appennine group that kept emanating people, right? The idea, as always, is a bit like today, that the florid, affluent areas of the more developed parts make less children, or less motivated, whatever. These were more warlike populations, and they tended just to pour out. It's a bit like the Germans before, Scandinavia in the ethnographic trope being considered as the vagina of peoples, because at the waves, historically, peoples were descending from there. Here, basically, within the Italian landscape, it's basically the same dynamic. The Apennines hold some of the most ancient Italian population, and specifically from this phenotype, one of Indo-European or of strong Indo-European origin, to say the least. As we were saying before, this people from the settlement evidently came from a northeastern direction. And this is what we know, generally speaking, about the Indo-European migration into Italy, that entered from Central Europe, more or less from where the later Ostrogoths and Longobards would, near the Balaton, south of the Danube. They entered northern Italy, and they began to descend south, following the Adriatic, and reaching literally like the tip of the boot, crossing the Strait of Messina, and settling in Sicily as well. This is all, by the way, proven simply by also the languages that were spoken there. The Osco-Sabellic, as the largest part of the Italic branch. And this has brought even to some speculations that the Latino-Faliscans that are, so also the group to which the Romans belonged, in part as you know, there were Sabines, who were from the Sabellic group at the foundation of Rome, that stretched literally into parts of today's historical center of Rome, from the Appennines, the east, would have been from probably Northern Europe, meaning coming from places like today's Germany, or even further north, because they would have followed this sort of more Tyrrhenian axis coming down. This is just purely speculative, and it's not even a thing, telling the truth. It's more likely, in my opinion, that this infiltration happened, say the separation between these two branches happened just because of the Apennines themselves, so that some filtered through the Apennine valleys on the Tyrrhenian side and sort of began to distinguish themselves. But it is possible that such thing happened, whereas, in fact, the Oscan group would have come from the east, and possibly even from the Balkans, considering that there were Illyrian peoples on the Adriatic coast of Italy as well, just next to the Oscans, that had just crossed the sea from the Balkans, and so belonging also to two importantly distinct branches of the Indo-European peoples, especially if you consider that there may have actually been a Nordic stock, maybe exactly in that sense, coming from the north in addition. So it's actually a mix of, say, the actual geographical direction that these peoples had come from and sort of the paths that they followed, and how they eventually amalgamated with the locals that we sort of observe as an outcome of this regional differences in phenotypic distribution. Meaning what? Meaning that some more populated areas, of course, would have rendered, in relative terms, these invaders a smaller minority, right? And therefore, the trace of them would have depleted more likely with this more strongly within this broader pool. However, we also know, as we will see today, that there was a very strong awareness of the Romano-Italic peoples of their own ancestry, of at least what their ancestors would have looked like, and in a way that perhaps this is the most difficult thing to understand if you really have zero background on the topic. They truly attributed racial value to, in an archetypal sense. In fact, this is the entire point, and that I made also at the beginning of the other video. This video has no intention to sort of either criticize or overthrow what we already know pretty clearly about this all. Like, this is not like a debatable. Like, we just don't know how it happened, but the genetic outcome is pretty evident. Yes, there are different theories about specific pools or whatever, but the broader Indo-European identity of the Romano-Italic peoples is crystal clear. Like, it exudes from literally everywhere. We've seen it very often from the language, its etymology, the archetypal values, the myths, the sagas, the general, like how their temples, like how their religious life, their military lifestyle, whatever, it's all 100% clear in the essence. There is nothing to add in this regard. And this video is not aimed either at, in fact, claiming the Romans to have been, in this sense, as a whole people of what would come to dominate as Italy, more or less. Sicily was actually excluded because it was not part of Italia. Cisalpine Gaul would end up being that, so that's more or less the thing. But that's also another story. We will not talk about it now. But in general, that was the core that dominated the empire and self-represented itself more in all what we consider as more generally Roman from that spring, remaining also the general model for Romanity in a broader sense until the end of the empire. The history of the Italic peoples is so underrated. Nobody talks about them. Nobody celebrates this dimension, right? If you make a tour of YouTube, there is a disproportionate representation, and not just, let's say, by size. You could argue that's even normal, like the Celts or the Germans. These were all, of course, filtered through how history also came to be. But if you talk about, I don't know, the Thracians or the Barons, there is great attention towards them. If you look at the Italics as a people, I don't know whether it's because there is a difficulty, and maybe, I don't know, it's actually a complicated story in terms of, say, there is a lot archaeologically and documentarily in many ways. But of course, it's not easy to study because it takes a lot. And very often these people, since they were eventually conquered by Rome, they became, say, identitarily speaking, something closer to the idea of romanity that was stemming from the same background, but of course gradually flattening such, not necessarily the identities per se, but the way they would participate into romanity as such. Like they were, imagine again being part of this bigger natio, right, of Italics, headed by Rome and going at the conquest of the world. We don't have, like, say, Marian times that is, I don't know, on the base of the average legionary and eventually, its settlement in other lands. It's this enormous. We do know where they were originally of, and so etc. But the Romans themselves were pretty warlike people. They did not see even their self-description as something so manly or something so something that would have had to go beyond the self-actualization of them as warriors in the conquest of the world by divine mandate as the chosen people of God. And so there is something much more powerful at play that was actually spurring a great sense of pride from all the various backgrounds. In many ways, it's true that during the Roman Empire, coming even from a less developed background was something that at least these peoples would be more, a bit like today to a degree, to emphatically boast, but that's in fact also a degree of provincialism that especially the Romano-Italic confederacy from which the empire stemmed from, like, had surpassed in this broader Romanness or Italianness as well that already existed, was especially boosted by Augustus. But as you know, there had been a social war exactly over this issue of the full Romanization of the Italics. All things we have already covered here and there, but I think you're familiar with. But if you look at beautiful sites like the one of Alfedena, you understanding that sort of hardcore Apenninic warrior background that was this sulky, these peoples that had been first subdued and then co-opted by Rome, eventually Romanized, fully partake in this great imperial enterprise, had been about even just very few generations before, right? This is the part that we have sort of forgotten as well. To most people, history is a matter of, I project national, again, 19th century sort of style national identities to antiquity. I've heard people saying, why would the Romans have red hair? I don't remember the Gauls conquering Rome. We have this kind of brain damaged people who think that, the Romans are a sort of, replicator that started only within, the confines of the Roman city, or that the Romans themselves were just not the sum of these other peoples within the peninsula. And even just ignoring the most obvious notion that, yes, there were even red hair, that those would have been rarer in a general sense, but it's not even that there were. And as a matter of fact, we will get it, in fact, from the Roman onomastics that we are all very aware of, containing such references to red hair and more. So there is another point actually that I should make. The main attempts to claim this more Nordic influence on, say, in Rome, pertains to specifically the elites, right? And so, of course, also the most represented in history in general, especially at this time. And so something that has been criticized because it sounded too much racially suprematistic, whatever, but if you actually know what, say, ancient elites thought of their blood and their divine descendants, etc., is actually not, and especially when you realize, and we will see now, how they self-represented themselves in an overly disproportionate blonde or blue-eyed fashion, you realize that may have actually and actively concentrated their own a certain particular phenotype and genotype within the same establishment. This is not strange. This is really something you can find throughout all European history, ancient medieval, even beyond. And it's also kind of obvious because they would have been the same people who conquered initially, and that doesn't matter how surely blended they were with the locals, intermarriage, etc. Hence, we're still bearing that trait in a way that, in fact, if you believe that, especially before the Indo-European invasion, that wasn't, of course, people were darker at large, had caused them in the first place, and would, as their language, for example, being able to affirm itself on the rest of the people, right? How is that, this was a minority and they managed to extend their language over this land, right? This is not, really, this is true for all of Europe, because the Europeans were not there at the point, and we began to speak that. So evidently, the self-awareness of in identity regarding values, language, appearance was incredibly high, and would obviously remain that high, considering if you the actual meanings that we will see now were explicitly attached to them. This is no mystery to anyone. There's not a question mark. We do not know. Maybe we'll see now what the etymologies of properly the adjectives that they used to represent themselves were about. If anything, being just Indo-European, but having a very distinct Indo-European meaning, which is the one of the Imperial Catholic tradition, of course. So let's skip, let's say, other considerations regarding, in fact, such cultural ethnic divides. The sense, however, is that, for example, in the greater comparison that we have in Latin literature between the Romans and the Etruscans, we find a sensible gap, right? For example, probably the moral temper of the Etruscans, that were sort of more vibrant, colorful, sensual, sometimes dark, sometimes joyful, and also tormented by this terrible afterlife, was quite dark and chthonic. And this instead rigid, rough, Quiritian severity of the Latin and the Oscan peoples, that were manifestations of a different ethnos in principle. Doesn't matter how mixed they were, how actually similar they were, even in this divides, but the sense that was this more brutal, compact, warlike, rigid, militarized, say cold, Indo-European backbone of the Italian peninsula, especially in the Apennines, is more primitive, violent shepherds dedicated to raiding, to duels, etc., contrasted with a culture that was actually arguably the same violence, but it was much sort of more, for example, stratified. In the Etruscan side were a very few rich people, and all the others lived in some sort of serfs working in the field. This was not conceivable in the Latin or the Sabellian world. They were all pretty, militarized peoples, even though there was, a servile substratum. And of course, especially in Rome, when you see how big the city was, of course, there is the contrast between the patricians and the plebeians, but also mirroring in different scale that same sense of the best peoples ruling over the worst ones in terms of individual merit. And that may have actually had that sort of racial bias, even though the elites themselves were still open to a degree. Like the Indo-European ones were generally, where the concept of Aryan means etymologically the one of nobility. And so again, this mixes would exist, but they would always be aimed at some sort of racial superiority that could also, however, contribute to the gradual darkening of the, at least of the Indo-European elites. We see, for example, in Propertius 1:32-47, the formidable Sabines, the rigidis Sabinis, which and is an adjective used by Ovid in the Amores 11:4-15 for the rigidae Sabinae, so the Sabine women as well. This was extended to the whole ethnos in the sense of severity. But what is the etymology of the word rigid, rigidus? Well, it is derived from the verb regio, which means to be stiff or to stiffen. The term originates from the Proto-Italic regio, which is linked to the Proto-Indo-European root reg. And this brings the primary meaning of to stretch out. Basically, the rigidity is when like you extend your arm and it remains with the muscles rigid. It was this sense of the extension of the armed arm, right, of the weapon, and of properly imperial ritual of domination. This idea of stretching is persistent because it evokes the image of something that is extended and taut, suggesting inflexibility or resistance to bending. And so in this context, the concept of rigidity emerges as something that does not yield easily, highlighting the notion of stiffness associated with the term. The other meaning attached to rigid, and to the same fact in the Proto-European root, is to bind. And this interpretation instead ties to the idea of something being constricted or held together tightly, a bit like the fasces, which aligns with the aforementioned concept of a tough people that is also tough, not just individually but collectively. When an object is bound, it often becomes stiff and unyielding. The subbinds are described also as very strong, fortes, very stern men by Cicero in the Proligario 32, in the Athenaeum 1536. Now the term force, plural fortis, comes from the Old Latin forctus, which also comes from Proto-Italic forctus, and the Proto-Indo-European berg, which means to rise, high, hill. So strength actually is connected to being tall. There is also another Proto-Indo-European etymology that is derg, that is to say to bind fast, to be firm, strong. So something very similar as we've seen to rigid in meaning. But we're not specifically sure whether it's possible that we're actually connected to begin with. The other term, stern, that Cicero uses is severus in Latin. This comes from the Proto-Italic severus, which also comes from the Proto-Indo-European sever, which contains the root seg, meaning to hold, so to overpower. So severity actually had to do with this seigneurial, imperial force, right? The subbinds that were very important for the Romans in this perspective, because they were again the sabellic element at the origin of the city, right? The rape of the subbinds brought the Latin Romans to eventually seize the Sabine women and to procreate with them. So the Romans descended from these people, as you know, were ideally 1/3 of the original Roman army, as a matter of fact, and they were described as ancestors of resilient generations of soldiers and farmers, rusticorum militum, so rural soldiers, rural fighters. And this is very important to look at within the same Italic world, the Latin, the Roman perspective on the Osco-Sabellic populations. There are also, of course, the same adjectives used for the Romans, clad in their austere and severe impersonal garb, all right? And a general sense that the Romano-Italic confederacy as a whole, commanded by Rome by the Second Punic War, could produce a military youth on the cheeks of which a flava lanugo had not yet extended. This is a quote from Silius Italicus Punica to 319. So it's interesting, these were even later sources compared to the events, and the Romans are self-representing, to say the Romano-Italics in this case were self-representing themselves as blonde, right? We're talking Xantha Carina, the same term resonating in the Sibylline Oracles 346. This is incredibly important because, for example, in Metatron's video, you heard this inexplicable explanation that was not sourced, even though the author cares very much about saying that, between an alleged Flavian attribute pertaining just to the Celts or the Germans, and for the Romans just sub Flavum. So there wasn't even the explanation of who are the Romans in this sense. The Romano-Italics, never that term was even used. Well, here you have the Romano-Italics using the term Flavus, of course, for themselves, as we will see many other occasions, to the point, especially the Aeneid. Metatron didn't cite that, where you find plenty of it. He cited a couple of information from Malalas, talking later Byzantine times. You have the entire Latin literature. You make a video only on that, and you claim that the Romans did not have Flavian people? Are you out of your mind? The term Flavus is derived from the Proto-Italic Flavus, which in turn comes, again, of course, from the Proto-Indo-European Blavus, meaning shiny/white. So it's not only blonde, as a matter of fact. It could be extended to the hair color, like almost albino. But the concept behind the etymology goes beyond mere color. It stresses a divine power of some sort. In fact, you have other Latin terms such as fulgo or flamma, meaning to sparkle, like coming to the same adjective, fulgid, right, of the flame, right. In Sanskrit, we find bala, which is connected with splendor. In Proto-Germanic, you have belio, that means bonfire. In the Proto-Baltic, Slavic pale. In Proto-Slavic, belio, it all means white, right? So it's blonde, but also flaming and white, right? So really something heavenly and connected with that higher sense of divinity, that here, again, by these sources, the Sibylline oracles and Silus Italicus Punica are extended to the Romans. Of course, in all traditional cultures, such appearance was connected with a very specific set of values. There was no such thing like a separation between mind and body. This is actually what the later Romans, mostly from a Greek background, began to separate, mostly stressing the fact that, let's say, the two aspects were sort of divided. It is true that there was a general sense that of spiritual race that would transcend, in fact, for example, the big but sort of dumb barbarian. It actually pertains to the entire Indo-European mythology. As you know, this is true in the clash of the Titans. This is true in the clashes against the Netherworlders from the side of the Aesir, etc. So it's the size also can be separated from the actual quality. And this goes to a degree of, say, recognizing that later on in history, these blonder people were not superior to the Romans, but this is not really what the Romans themselves believed about themselves from their, especially so-called Republican times. Were actually never a republic in Roman history, but nevertheless, the set of values that, of course, indicated the Roman Senate, the patrician clans, had been the warlike one of enlightened audacity, controlled demeanor, concise and composed speech, well-considered resolutions, a bold sense of domination. There are all Indo-European traditional values in general. Not only, but very much emphasized, right, as you know, in Roman culture, and extended to that higher degree of political and institutional identity that this elite literally incarnated. The nobilitas, right? So this is the same anthropic model from which ethical virtues like virility, so the broader virtus, the sum of all, that means warriorhood. The virtus, very few people know that, it was actually the sacred fury, what the Romans would call furor, actually later on, for the Germans, etc. originally. Now, it had been more idealized in a sort of higher sense, but virtus means exactly that. I made a video on the European sacred fury, and this was one of them. But say courage, or the fortitudo, that, as we've seen before, was even actually a physical attribution of height that becomes a virtue, a moral of moral strength. Wise reflection, the sapientia, the self-formation, the disciplina, dignity, the gravitas, respect, pietas. Here we translate them a bit like this, but of course they are untranslatable. They have very specific meanings, and also the derived, say, modern transliterations in our languages do not mean in our languages exactly what the Latins meant in that way. You have the measure solemnity, the solemnitas. So this was all intrinsically Roman, and as we've seen, there was a set properly of physical values connected to the moral ones in the same etymologies of these terms. There is a list of physical qualities that Quintilian recalls while talking about the origin of proper names. We are in the De Institutione Oratoria 1.4. It says, ex habito corporis Rufus longosque fecerunt. From the physic, they called Rufus one with red hair, Longus one of tall stature. So this is kind of obvious. I cite this because, of course, Quintilian is talking about the Romans and the origin of their names. So the Romano-Italics, of course, had blonde, as we've seen, red-haired people. Like, height is relative, but we know that they weren't that short, actually, just a few inches compared to Central European populations. We have enough anthropometric evidence, whereas you cannot fake whether you're blonde or red, right? And there was sort of some strange point made relativistically about this in that aforementioned video by Metroton, is to say, in order to call one like that, it must have been rare to have. Like, I don't know, Eric the Red was, a rare redhead in the Viking world, in the broader sort of also partly Gaelic west of the Viking incursions. No, right? If, as we've seen, the Celts and the Germans very often cited as blonde and red-haired, in contrast with, of course, the prevalently darker Romans had this, this characteristic. How could, in Viking times this be such a strange thing, right? You can say that redhead is mostly connected with the Celts, but they had had enough time to blend, believe me, and also just to have, of course, red hair among the Germans to begin with, where all the movements also back and forth from Scandinavia that happened during the migration year. But this does not mean that it's, such a rarity to begin with, right? You have, first of all, lots of gentes that are probably called Flavi, Flaviani, Rubi, Rufi, Rufini, Rutili. If you don't have enough people having such colors, you don't even have all these clans named after them. And we know very well that Sulla had red hair, Nero, the Aino-Barbi that were in fact the Copperbeard clan that had married into the Julian one, in fact, to produce such offspring, were called just like that. By the way, the root for the word Rufus is from the Proto-Italic rudus, and it was borrowed from a Sabellic language as well, as what we were saying before about the concentration of red hair, by the way, even among the Oscans, that you would say, but only the Celts have red hair. Well, the Sabellians were the least exposed to the Celts. The Romans were more exposed to the Celts, hence this for them. You have the Uscan Rufris, the Umbrian Rufru, you have a Faliscan variety. By the way, the fact that red hair were considered to be connected with divinity is proven by the fact that there was a legend about the Aino-Barbi explaining how they got their name as two young men, messengers of a divinity, had touched the bird of a Roman warrior, which had turned red, eventually being the ancestor of this clan. So surely there is a connection there with the gold, with the red. We talked about this in the video about the Sol Invictus and the one about sacred royalty. We've seen how the red was connected specifically with the sun, with it's to be found really many cultures, and the same Roman triumphal practice of painting one's face red during the triumph once entered Rome, going towards the temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, giving the spolia of the enemy to God, was in fact mirroring exactly the fact that Jupiter himself was red in that sense. So the emperor, for a while, had elevated himself through the God-given imperium to such redness. Naturally, blue eyes were even more common. Like we have Caesius as an adjective, from which we have names, very famous names as Caeso, Caesar, Caesulla, Caesilla, Caesenius, Caesonius. It really means in Indo-European as a broader sense, like bluish gray, gray-eyed, blue-eyed, cat-eyed, catting, sharp, right? In this case, in Latin, comes from the Proto-Italic caedo, from the Proto-Indo-European cade, to cat hue. So this is relevant because, as we've seen in the same videos about the sacred royalty, the idea of providentia, and so the fact that through your, of course, eye of the spirit, you would be able to mold the world, your will, in this sense, to be able to cut, to fight, etc., through the eyes, is something that comes back prevalently. The Romans were very careful about somebody's eyes. That was seen as the mirror to the soul. And persons like Caesar and Augustus were felt to have that specific divine gaze that would manifest their own living imperium. In the Historia Augustalius, verse 2:4, Caesar is referred to with the term Caesius. For grey eyes, the appropriate adjectives were ravus or ravidus, it's more specific. Hence, again, some clans, the gens Ravilia or Ravilla. Again, this is actually not that few. Again, this is not just a nickname. You have entire clans that are named after such color. And it's not like you have other clans that are called with sort of, these guys are dark-haired or dark-eyed. There's no such thing, actually. They don't boast that. There is no real deal about it. And not just because evidently these were the minority in general. We do not know among the elites, but presumably so. But there might have been, as we've seen, an actual attempt to preserve this within these families as a hallmark of divinity. But it is evidently connected with these values, right? By the way, Ravidus stems from the Proto-Indo-European gre, which means to glow, to be visible. So these blue eyes were understood to be sort of powerful, to stand out, and evidently divinely connected. Raviliae ravis oculis, just as Caesullae derives from Caeses, which is what Sextus Pompeius Festus in the De Verborum Significatione 274, 42, 43 explains to us. So it wasn't just like in Latin literature, these ideas were rarely laid out or occurring. The Romans cared, of course, like all ancient peoples, about these physical qualifications, naturally in leadership, in connection with the soul. That was simply the reflection of. Then about size, we have, here it's more relative because it depends on what we're talking about, but the reference to such broader physical capacities is relevant in Latin onomastics. You have longus, longinus, magnus, maximus. These latter two come from the Indo-European meg, which is also the etymology for macer, which of course means not just like in Latin maximus, let's say the top, etc., but to properly to increase, to raise, to increase, to be long. And this has, as you understand, even a broader connection with the concept of Augustus, of augere, right, of Sebastos from Greek. There were lots of parallels, of course, with other Indo-European languages we're not making now. But it's remarkable that in the Latin onomastics, as you understand here, is very closely connected to the patriciate, and especially it seems that the nobler families of Rome had a prevalence of these physical qualification in their onomastics. Tells a lot. The same Scipio means stick, for example. It actually refers to the man's virility, and so any sort of kind of size mattering in this case, as a matter of fact, but referring to tall statures in general. This is interesting because in slang and many European languages, the indication for stick is also referring to virility, but the vulgarization doesn't actually hide also the broader connotation of sort of augmentation and the actual characteristics of these people. And then we have the name albus, albinus, albus, that indicate a light complexion. From Proto-Italic albus, from Proto-Indo-European helbus, connates include the Umbrian alfu, the ancient Hellenic alphos, which means whiteness, the Hittite alpas, which means cloud, right? So all heavenly symbolism. We have the Middle Welsh elbid, which means world as a whole, the English elf, and the Russian lebed, that means swan. And think about the Lohengrin and the Knight of the Swan arriving from the north to rule over the decayed lands. This, in an Indo-European mythological sense, is extremely important because that the adjective albus is pretty widespread in also Western Europe because of the Indo-European meaning in the Celtic languages and so on. But I would like to point out that, as you know, the most important sanctuaries of ancient Latium for all the Latin people was Alba Longa, right? So the tall Alba, the tall, if you want Dawn, Alba is in some languages properly, in Italian still, connected with the rising sun. And so think about, for this Indo-European etymology, what Alba Longa, for the essentially before Rome, the greatest, most important of the sacred places of Latium, could really inspire to these peoples. In the appendix to the Incertia Auctoris Liber de Praenominibus from Tiberian times, we find names for girls such as Rutilia, Caesella, Rhodochylia, Murcula, and Burra, which all speak of blonde, but as you understand here, red hair. Murcula comes from murex, meaning purple. Rhodochylia comes from the Hellenic rhodax, meaning rose. And Burra, as well as burrus, comes from the Hellenic puros, so referring to fire, all referring to at least a bright hair color. And you see here that blondes and redheads were not rare at all, onomastically speaking, so they must have been something, right? Not, again, this video is not designed to say, oh my god, so the Romans were all, the elites were all pure Aryan. This is not what we're saying. We're saying that the Romans represented themselves largely through such, as we'll see now better in the religious works, ideal appearance connected, yes, with fair traits. There's no doubt about this whatsoever. It was part of their nobility, it was part of their universal imperial belief. There's no way around it, right? By the way, there is what every person who says that the Romans did not discriminate in a physical sense, this is very famous. Like, if you don't know this phrase, it's because you've never read Horace, and it's also, again, very very hard quote that says, hic niger est, unc tu Romane caveto. That is to say, this one is black, beware of him, Roman. Right? And this is literally what it means. I'll not repeat it because maybe YouTube thinks I'm saying something different, but in Latin, this is literally what it means. This one is black, beware of him, Roman. There was an obvious anthropological naturality in thinking that darker is worse. And here, like, the term means black, but it's not like we are referring to what we conventionally call today black people, like sub-Saharan Africans. We're here that there is a broader sense of darkness. And so it's even more poignant because Horace is telling, and in which context Horace comes from is historically. So we are in the fullest of Romano-Italicness at its peak, really. Here it's beware of whoever is darker, and darker than you in practice. And in this sense, all Roman means that these Romans at the time, that were largely Romano-Italic peoples, also the ones now colonizing the rest of Europe, still being of Romano-Italic ancestry overwhelmingly, essentially, fundamentally, had to beware of darker peoples. So here we have the Romans in comparison to other peoples and say, whoever is darker, beware of them. Right? And this is true. Actually, it's not Romans, it's Roman, singular, so this is just even at an individual level. Actually, I could quote a lot of passages from the idea that there were Levantine slaves and freedmen, etc., that the Romans did not like, and that's actually true. It's a leitmotif of Latin literature as well, but there are not a radical expression about the darkness necessarily, rather the fact that they were people of sort of dubious moral background, right? Especially the freedmen, this easily enriched sort of former slaves that, of course, just by their origin were to be, say, despised, especially by the nobility, right? Especially coming from another country that's such a different one from Italy. So this is definitely self-explanatory. I mean, I don't think I have to add much else. This is not a matter of context. The context is the one we're seeing, right? That's literally what they believe. There is an interesting passage from the Aeneid that now we will cite a bit more in depth. For 698, it says, "Nondum illi flavit." It's just a couple of lines. "Nondum illi flavum Proserpina vertice crinem abstulerat." This refers to the fact that Proserpina, the deity of the underworld, at the moments of somebody's death, would cut off their blonde hair, right? So here, since they're talking about the Italic ancestors of the Aeneid, this actually, as we will see, the Aeneid speaks only about blonde people. All the heroes are blonde, even Dido, the Carthaginian queen. So that's pretty clear. That the idea is that the Romans saw themselves through this most official, noble antiquarian literature, the Virgilian excellency of Roman culture and literature and civilization, as fair-haired people, right? Now, as I was saying before, there are lots of different scholars in the past that tried here we're talking also about before World War II, etc., in a completely different cultural temper from ours, to stress the Nordicness of the Italics. This is, again, in this video, what we do not need to do, because we do not see that, right? We do not see the fact that they actually were. But even more importantly, as I was saying, we see that the Romans projected themselves in their past ancestry as such, right? Here, of course, like, it's not like we have what the average Romano-Italic person said or thought, but if the Roman literature that we have talks about this, even more, there is a reason if they don't represent themselves with darkness. However, some of these scholars, because they were biased, indeed, some of them racialists, there is no doubt that it was the temper of the time. We're talking about the age of fascism, of Nazism, etc., but also before, thought that, say, at least they misquoted certain passages. We will see it, in the end, right? but to force some sort of, I don't know, maybe there was a guy dyeing his hair blonde and said, this guy was blonde. No, it wasn't. You have to be very accurate also in the quoting. You have to understand the context indeed. One author was Wilhelm Zieglin, born 1855, died 1935. So you can immediately see like the cultural temper. He was a German historian. Would give some relatively unreliable account of basically the actual number of ancient Italic figures that were represented as blonde versus the one that were dark. And this data is unreliable because, again, he had this sort of relatively biased criterion, but it was not just, say, it wasn't really an evil person per se. Like, he was actually in good faith, but he made mistakes. In any case, he really did list 63 blonde individuals and only 17 dark-haired ones. Again, I haven't checked all the references, so take it as you want, but just bear in mind that there were people counting this in Latin literature, and definitely they weren't sort of by scale wrong. When you look, for example, at the Pompeii paintings that I also inserted here, for example, Metatron did so and said, "Oh, these guys are sort of dark." Are they? Actually, they have sort of red, blonde, or light brown, or dark blonde, if you prefer, hair. Right? Not all of them, but the wide majority. Without mentioning that there are lots of symbols of different kind, for example, sort of swastikas in the motives, that people said, oh no, this stuff began to appear only because of the Germans in the later Roman Empire. Nope. The same goes for the Sol Invictus. The Sabines had temples to that way before Christ. People do not... The real problem sometimes, even in those people that are today in good faith, is that they actually do not know because they have never studied traditional religion. They're not aware of the fact that they have an incredibly superficial and sort of simplistic view of ancient religion that in the more nuanced way just says something like, it's complex, we can't really know. No, we actually know, right? It's complex, but it's complex because you have to study that. You don't have just to quote strange things. Here, indeed, like a good 3/4 of the Pompeii frescoes, this is also what Zieglin correctly pointed out, are actually fair hair. Again, it's not like we're the first people that will look at this, nor that, say, somebody in the past, for example, having a biased background was wrong about everything, right? It's not how it works. There is also, and this is extremely clear in many sources, and probably Zieglin himself did not even count like the entirety of this, that the Roman deities are overwhelmingly described as blonde, right? There are some dark-haired, but in particular Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, Minerva, Proserpina, Ceres, Venus, and also allegorical figures like the Pietas, the Victoria, by the way, the Holy Ghost, the Nika, the Imperium, and Bellona are very often represented as blonde. Right? There is no doubt about this. In all the antiquarian sources, the fasts, there are so many of these references to the blondness of the deities. In the legendary stories, I guess in the Roman sagas, blondness appears. We do not see essentially dark-hairedness. The same is true for poets, for example. We have a staunch, an overwhelming actual prevalence of blondness compared to darkness. Again, to an extent we may not fully know. This starts getting down to, again, but so what about this distribution? Why? Here we do not even need to explain. Again, this doesn't change the fact that the majority of the Romano-Italic people were normally dark-haired. like brown hair, brown eyes, like practically all over Europe, but the frequency of fair hair, blue eyes, must have been something, possibly, especially in the establishment, because this may have been, over the generations, sort of more conservative groups that sort of intermarried into one another. They were essentially, like, Roman society was always oligarchic, right? It was always an important divide. It's not like, again, the story of the citizenship means that so everybody could do whatever. No, there were very heavy social divides. And we wanted to represent, again, the Greeks especially, and the Romans as just, I don't know, democratic republics. They weren't. Rome always was an oligarchy, and it eventually turned into a monarchy. Well, they had been a monarchy also in the early days, but, and we'll go back to the Romulan era, hopefully soon, with our videos, but it's very important to stress how it wasn't just that melting pot that you have been forcibly brought to believe just because of, I don't know, a parallelism on sort of the major powers in the West, say, I don't know, Britain, the United States. It had to be a melting pot. Why? Right? We don't have that evidence. You can't say that within this establishment, as I was saying before, there was a greater mobility. These people eventually went over to rule over other provinces, for example. Definitely in the ranks of the officiality, there were people from the provinces when citizenship was extended, but at large, right? If you look at the various pools, right, of regional peoples in Europe, we know very well that in the West especially, they remained virtually unaltered throughout this time. It was an ethnic majority that remained fundamentally always the same, and only minorly altered. Cato the Censor, I made a video about him some months ago, Cato Censor, that embodied romanity at most, like at least he incarnated many of the most ancient virtues of Rome, was known for his red hair and blue eyes. I nailed the thumbnail about his portrait. Actually, I represented him so blondish, almost albino. He actually had red hair and blue eyes. Sulla, the restorer, was portrayed with blonde hair and blue eyes. Actually, I knew red hair. Augustus, the founder of the empire, is depicted with straight blonde hair, light eyes, phlegmatic, composed in demeanor. Again, we will look at Augustus because there was here the term sub flavum used, yes, but as we've seen, it was plenty, and we'll see more of this references to flavum, actually, rather than sub flavum. And again, the entire story that the Romans were of a different category of flaviness is not supported by any evidence that we have, right? Just as there are blonde, very blonde people in Italy today, even if infrequently, doesn't mean that this were just, a Germanic legacy. They were there since Indo-European ancestors, and as we've seen, this came even with red hair. And this is interesting because, as we've seen, the Celts are mostly the ones connected with that, but of course there were red-haired people also before that. This is true also for pre-Indo-Europeans, and not making even a staunch divide there in general. But of course, Indo-Europeans were more loaded with that. We know, on the other hand, for example, Caesar having even properly black eyes and hair, but I don't know about you, but I can't really say what it is black-eyed. I've never seen a person like that, and it's extremely rare in Europe, also in Italy to begin with. Everybody has some sort of sort of dark brown at the most, and it's not even prevalent, right? So eyes are the ones that tend to be the lightest, and so when we read this black in Latin, we have to understand dark of some kind, as we've seen with Horace before. So it's not like necessarily was sort of, so hair is much more likely. because it's full of probably black-looking hair, even though maybe that's melanin that has covered hair, but maybe these people as children were blondish, reddish. It's absolutely common. But say that's more likely than black eyes, as a matter of fact. Also, Caesar was known for his very fair complexion and was notably tall. The Latin poets often sing of blonde, fair-haired women. We have the blonde and blue-eyed Delia for Tibullus. Ovid mentions a blonde Corinna. Propertius writes of a blonde Cynthia. There is general, there are other information regarding at least the fact that Romans did care about such different colors. The highest praise is, however, always for the candid girl. The most important poetic work that we were, of course, citing part also before for the sake of practicality is the Aeneid, to which we have to dedicate white space. This is a massive pool of blondness regarding probably the very ancestry of the Romans. There's no doubt that Virgil, that works as a sort of archaeologist poet, expressed a passionate admiration for the style of ancient Romans and exalting Latinity through the celebratory depiction of their origins, which is deeply connected with the fairness of their appearance. In the Aeneid, all the characters are portrayed as blonde. This is not random. This is explicit. As we said before, we see a lot of reference in Latin culture to blondness and to red-hairedness. We don't see to darkness, and disproportionately so. Lavinia is described as the greatest emblem of female virtue in this way. This is the Aeneid 12,605. You can check all this out. We're talking the Aeneid. We're talking about the pillars of Western civilization, right? Filia prima manu, Flavos, Lavinia, Crinis, et rosea laniata genes, right? Actually, in the text, it's written Floros, not Flavos, but it does mean Flavos, and there is obviously also a connection with the term, because chloros, as you know, means green, yellow in Greek, right? So this was term mutuated in part from the Greeks, aside from the common Indo-European ancestry. At this point, the Romans had adopted some vocabulary from Hellenic literature, and so if you read Floros, you read there something light, right, to say the least. Aeneas himself, characterized by nobility, is in his visage and hair comparable to ivory adorned with gold. This is the Aeneid 1592. Quale manus addunt ebori decus, aut ubi flavo argentum parius velapis circumdatur auro. Right, so ivory adorned with gold. Right, this is Aeneas' hair. This is the prototype of romanity. He's a guy who has ivory hair, right, adorned with gold, right, in its blondness, right? It's literally that, right? The young Iulus, so the son, the offspring that would eventually bring the gens Julia, mythologically, legendarily, and Mercury are depicted et crinis flavos et membra decora juventa, right? Notably, among the warriors, we find the fulvus camers of the Ausonian nation. This is the Aeneid 10,562. Here we have explicitly, you have heard well, a red-haired Italian warrior. The Ausonia was Italy at the time, and here we're told that this was an Ausonian guy, so a guy coming from Italy being red-haired. Right, and here we are, Ausonia stands properly for Italy, from Vitelli, etc. It is not referring to the Celtic invasions had yet to happen. We're talking a mythological time of many centuries before. So we notice here that not only none of the warriors or other characters in the Aeneid are described as having dark hair, but that blondness and even red-hairedness were present in this context. Naturally, Aeneas comes from Troy, but this guy is so blonde, purely blonde, and he gets to Italy and he finds a local warrior that is fulvus, that has red hair. Even the Carthaginian Didyl is depicted as blonde. I point this out because this shows how, of course, there is no malicious intent to claim that these sources were depicting how people were at the time, right? You went out there in Rome and you have all people with ivory hair. That's obviously not true. But how important was it for them to represent their own heroes like this, I think, is obvious. There is no sense of otherness to blondness or red-hairedness among the purest sap of Latin literature. This work of the Aeneid, as you know, is an epos in its own kind, and it expresses all this antiquarian identitary pride of the Romano-Italic peoples that at this point have really dominated the entire Mediterranean and are consolidating their control of continental Europe. And they represent themselves like this. Like, if you were to just stick to the pop culture of the story, the Romans were just a bunch of, dark, short people out there. They thought that, blonde and red hair were weird. They were representing themselves in their official literature and religion as blonde, blue-eyed, red-haired, which is even more bizarre because red hair is definitely rarer. It was at the time, as it is today, in the Italian peninsula. But there is, and there was. And so there is actually nothing strange about this, and these colors are there because, of course, they had a meaning for these peoples. By the way, the passage about the blonde queen of Carthage is the Aeneid 4590. Flaventisque abscissa comas. And by the way, here you don't find subflavum or whatever. No, it's purely blonde, right? So there is no mistake around any. I don't know how the thing about subflavum came out. Of course, this refers to the literal couple we'll see later, Imperial references, but the term existed. But it's not like this was completely invented. It was a category of darker blondness just for people who lived in Italy. There were, of course, darker blondes than there would have been in the Jutland, but there were also blondes, and the term Flavian was used for the Romano-Italic peoples extensively, as we've seen today, by the way. There's definitely no secret about the fact that the Virgilian epos highlights a strong tendency to envision ancient heroes and heroines enveloped in a cloud of original blondness. In the same way, in Ovid's Fasti, which had, we were mentioning them before, especially because you find in it all those blonde deities, and in fact is a work that was composed with a similar antiquarian and celebratory intent to the Virgilian one. The heroes and heroines of Roman antiquity are also envisioned as blonde. For example, Lucretia, the great Roman matron who was violated by the evil Tarquin, is blonde. And because, of course, of this literature, also the later Western art depicted her as blonde. I mean, Lucas Cranach depicts her as blonde. Titian depicts her as blonde. I mean, notoriously, if you have a culture and an education, you have an ABC of Western identity, you know this. And if you don't, you're not a Westerner. It doesn't matter where you're born, what you look like, or whatever. You cannot afford to be a Westerner. Let's be incredibly honest about this, right? This is not... See, the point why I make this videos is to sort of make people realize that these topics are not a matter of subjective opinion. Right? This is not a matter you wake up one day, you decide what a people looks like or doesn't. Right? Here you have very specific references to immediately something that the Romans cared enormously about. And you can have a genetic evidence, you can have other evidence, historically, archaeologically, but if these people represent themselves, they're heroes and whatever, there is a specific reason. There is an Indo-European migration, there's an oligarchic society, there is a generalized reference in all Indo-European culture and beyond towards these differences, to which specific values are notoriously attached. Why is that we have erased this for Rome? How often have you heard this being said by anyone, right? In all the documentaries about Rome by, I don't know, Mary Beard, how often have you actually heard any of this? Do you wonder why you've never been told any of this? Right? This is not like a conspiracy theory, but it's the product of a very specific ideological machination that was created at your expenses to eliminate the references to these topics. Because people were properly told, like, if they did so, they would have been sort of ousted from particular milieu or career or whatever at some point in history. Today, we can simply and freely say how it was, but we don't do it because we've been habituated to think that this is some sort of strange scheme or scam, right? And by the way, like, this is all very, like, if you're European, these very sources that I'm citing, rather than being an idiot that fixates, in fact, of interracial differences within Europe, should be part of yourself, should be part of your soul, part of your identity, right? And you should know them by heart. Why don't you? Right? And here we have Lucretia being described, in fact, by Ovid in the Fast 763. Forma placet, niveusque color, flavique capilli. Niveusque. She's literally Snow White because her skin is white as snow. And she has blonde hair. Right? This is the prime of Roman femininity, womanhood, and all the symbols and virtues that were notoriously attached in the rigid and still rigidly and heavily patriarchal Roman society. That there's been a lot of sort of disgusting sort of sabotage made even about this concept that remained true throughout all Roman history. That is represented like this. Romulus and Remus, of course, are blonde, right? As well as Martia's offspring. In the same Fasti 360, we read Martia ter senos plores adoleverat annos et suberat flavae iam nova barba comai. So sub flavum maiais, these people are Flavian as hell, literally, because of the flame. What do we want to do about this? Do we want to ignore it? Regarding the soul-body connection, Ennius, also great among the great fathers of Latin literature, and probably the Italic one, right? The Romano-Italic one, Ennius Triacorda, if you know what I mean, could write Moribus antiquis res stat Romana virisco. This is very ancient, proper Latin literature, telling us that basically Roman values rested on a solid racial foundation, that there wasn't such a thing like, being a man in body and soul, and in that sense not having those kind of values, or at least you could degenerate morally, but you would degenerate with that same genetic probitas, integritas, were connected with very specific type of men. For example, there is a series of adjectives that the Romans attached to the vir, so to the warrior, to the man, to the prototype of that nobility. That was extended, let's stress this, among the Italics in a sort of like, again, they were all aristocratic society, but originally they were much more sort of warlike, compact, and sort of more egalitarian. Then they would come to stratify later, and how, for example, the Etruscans were, as we've seen. And there was this idea of the vir frugi, that is actually fit for food, but stressing their somatic connection. More than else, the most important terms are vir ingenus. Ingenus, I explained the etymology in one of the videos about tradition. I don't remember exactly which, but essentially, if you look at the Indo-European etymology, you will find out that ingenus stand for egg. So this is bizarre if you've never heard it, but essentially the ancients believed that when say mankind had degenerated from divinity, it had become ever more material and hard physically to become a rock. That's also Mithras' thing. He from a rock becomes the sun back because he winced entirely the forces of evil, etc. Because everything is actually alive, right? And the idea is that the older men, so the least spoiled ones originally were tender, physically speaking. I mean, they had a greater power than the the merely physical qualities we have described that existed, because they were tender, and so the egg was to show this that there was a softer core that, however, was more physically active, or energically loaded. All right. And ingenus, as you know, in romantic was equated to the freeman, right, proper, to the guy who was out there, was a true bear, a free Roman, etc. The same term simplex, for example, which would sound like simple, you would think that's a pejorative of some sort. No, the vir simplex was actually a great compliment, because it meant that his nature had not degenerated, had not overcomplicated itself, was closer to divine unity. Simplex in Latin, if you look at the Indo-European etymology as well, it means pure, unmixed, sincere, frank, open, without guile, unsuspecting. So someone who has no malice, also in a general sense. So this is a term of praise used in Latin literature, and refers to this ideal of manhood, right? So the noble nature is really crucial. Propertius draws a portrait of Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi and the daughter of Scipio Africanus. He says, basically, what her words would have been, mihi natura dedit leges a sanguina ductas, right? This is Propertius 4:11. What does this mean? It means that this woman had received the laws of Rome and of God in her nature through her blood. Actually, ductas, probably this laws had been led into her through her blood. I mean, her father had generated her with such moral values through her flesh, through her blood, right, through her Roman blood. Just think about this. That's how the Romans saw themselves. And there is sort of more melancholic note from the late Roman poet Prudentius at this point, that speaks of the decadence of the Roman Empire, stating that he hopes that the empire would be renewed so that the hair of the goddess Rome would become blonde again, which speaks volumes about how they saw the degeneration of appearance. In other words, it's your morality that deteriorates your genes, your immorality, as a matter of fact, or that can actually bring it back. So the term he uses is rursus flavescere. So that is to say, this is in Prudentius' reply to Symmachus, by the way, if you're interested in the source. As you understand, they're very easy to find. The idea is that Rome had lost, by the end of the empire, her blondness. In other words, Romanity, the Imperial Romanity, was connected with blondness. All right, and so this Indo-European ancestry, I think, is something we should really reflect upon more thoroughly. I will conclude in a while, but before, I want to discuss something. The aforementioned Zieglin brought a list, drew a list of all the emperors who would have been allegedly blonde hair and blue-eyed. And most of these were wrong data. Like, he had misquoted them in good faith, also because, making a mistake citing classical literature is not really flattering, for a cultivated person. And you can find online even how this version of his was criticized, and basically there is much less evidence about what the early Imperial Romans Roman emperors really looked like. So you can argue that at least until throughout all the, say, the 1st and the 2nd century AD, I also made a video about this for the army, for that matter, the connubium rights and the Italian genetic dominance in the Roman legions by that point. We have essentially Romano-Italic emperors. That's what I was saying in the beginning. This elite ruled, right? There are people coming from Spain, but these are actually Romano-Italic clans that had been installed there as administrators and had just remained, but their ancestry was Romano-Italic, and it wasn't much long before that it had been settled there. They always maintained connection with the broader Senate to become emperors as well. So we're talking in the first 2 centuries of the empire about essentially Italic rulers, all right? And the only evidence that we have for any color, really, is the following. So literally the entire amount of evidence that we have for the emperors of the first 2 centuries AD. We have Augustus, Suetonius 79, defined as light brown, fair, blondish. Subflavum is the term used. The eye color is is gray-eyed. The term for the eyes is glauci, from Pliny 11:143. Then you have, I'm just talking about actually the blonde hair and the blue eyes, because we know about Claudius that he had white hair, or Trajan that had gray one, so we do not know, right? But we have Nero having light brown, fair, blondish, subflavum hair, Suetonius 51. So here, basically, we have just two emperors. This is all we have about the subflavum from a single source, by the way. So there are people, again, that go as far as saying the Romans said that they were subflavi if they were blonde ever, because they couldn't be flavi, even though the entire, Latin literature says otherwise. Suetonius, as you know, is a sort of older source. He wasn't committing like a crime by saying what was evidently plausible, the fact that these people had light brown or actually dark blonde hair, depending on how you wanna call them, because actually subflavum is also debatable. Nobody really knows what they meant precisely. There is a huge philological, linguistical issue there. Because why? Because it's not a post-Linnean term. These people, as we've seen, use these colors with primarily and this is the beauty of the primitive Indo-European language, semantically loaded term, that they weren't even caring too much about the pigmentation per se. They cared about the broader concept of what they were. It could be even a moral judgment per se. And then the same Nero had gray eyes, Chaisis, Suetonius 51, same source. Then we have Galba being blue-eyed, Cairules eyes, Suetonius 21. Then we have, finally, Lucius Verus having naturally blonde-haired, Flaventum. So here, actually, the guy is also, if you look in the statues, had curly hair, right? That is an indication of some sort of, not two Indo-European genes mixed in between. But this guy was actually blonde. It's actually not strange at all to see a Mediterranean person with blonde hair, curly hair like him, for example. About Commodus, the source for Lucius Verus is the Historia Augusta Verus 10:7. We have also Commodus. It's not so important, but it says the same Historia Augusta Commodus 17:3 that he dyed his hair blonde for some reason, which may have been well connected to what we talked about through the entire video. Right. So if you look at Zieglin's list, is actually much longer. I have it here. He quoted like basically everybody being blonde hair, whatever. But he actually misquoted many of these terms. Most of the sources, by the way, most of the information for this came from Malalas. That is a much later source. It's Syrian, Greek, and it has nothing to do with this. And Zieglin misquoted this entire stuff poorly, right? And or like decided that there were blonde hair and blue eyes to point out that every single Roman emperor was blonde hair and blue eye. That was definitely a Nordicistic perspective, but it was wrong. However, and this is the point that I've never heard anyone making, if you actually look at this revised information about all the Roman emperors of the 1st and the 2nd century AD that were of Romano-Italic ancestry, and they represented, in fact, the best imperial establishment ruling of the rest of the empire, descending from those Indo-European Italians. All the colors that we know of are blonde and, or say light brown, fair, it's blondish hair and gray blue eyes. Now, of all this, if you multiply them for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, it's respectively 36 chances of this being completely random, being brown, blonde, whatever. The only time we know what kind of colors they had, it's blonde hair, blondish hair, and gray blue eyes. What are the odds for this? Just Commodus dyes his hair blonde, but we don't even know what his hair could be. Maybe he was red hair, but that's not likely. But I mean, and then we have the gray hair because they were older people, so we don't know what color they actually had. How likely it is for all the very few information that we have on these topics, that is admittedly just Suetonius and Pliny, all right? Now we have the Historia Augusta as well, but in general, and so we have for these stories evidently also lots of other emperors, and we're not told what they looked like, but we're told that these were the only ones we're told of were blondish and gray, blue-eyed. How likely it is that this is merely a coincidence? It could be that there was actually a high prevalence of blonde hair and blue eyes among the Roman emperors of Romano-Italic origin, and or that, and not just that we know, and that in this sense we're told that they had, but that this was something to be proud of, or something that they looked at as a mark of divinity, and or the religious meaning that we attach, we say they attach, and what we so attach to it, and so today we so today. This was the conclusive punchline. Now, what to make of this content? I don't know who's going to watch this video. Frankly, at this point I've got recently a bit better, say, traffic than before. I've been doing something a bit more strategic with the topics, and it seems that the algorithm was pleased with it. You were pleased with it, because that's how it works. It works through you. My Imperium works through you as well, and of course I work through God's one. But the point being, do we want to be serious or not about Romanity? Right? Here I don't want to hear about all the about. I don't really think that you're going to. It wouldn't make any difference in the first place. All the story up at the Romans were, I don't know, all the stories that can't say that the Romans were sort of tolerant towards race or whatever. It's plenty of information. Today I didn't even quote Apuleius, or there are some speeches from Septimius Severus that openly say that darker people were looked upon with suspicion. So this has always been there, right? People thinking that there wasn't there wasn't a racist divide in the sense that we understand racism as the 19th century social Darwinistic, zoologically materialistic, in this sense also anti-traditional ideology. No, but of course they had also actually a very heavy racial bias in ancient, everywhere. Like the entire, like the topic of the elite appearance in function to the descendants from divinity is extremely famous historiographically. It's not something that we invent or that we're trying to circumnavigate. We should stop to self-ghetto these topics to just not just the Nordicists or the racial supremacists say this. This has nothing to do with that. This is pure and plain and simple history, just from the most excellent spring, very clear, under sunlight, without any say misunderstanding possible, right? You can say everything. You can. We made some context here so that, as you've seen, it wasn't merely a list of information. We dealt with it critically. But find me one channel is actually even talking about this. I already made my thing with Metatron that, of course, made, I don't know, a 10 minutes video, 20 minutes video, I don't remember. I'm taking hours just to explain this, and of course making a very different point in general. But Metatron is just like sort of a secondary aspect here for the channel. Here we have to focus on the actual history. So we can naturally talk more about this topic. We can expand on it. We can talk more about the Italic peoples. I repeat it, as I said at the beginning, I think most people have zero understanding of whatsoever, not just Roman history, but even more pre-Roman history or properly Italic history, even during Roman times. It's just a topic you never hear of. Basically everything about the Roman Empire is, look, the Romans, they had the legions, the Colosseum, and it was big and it was kind of, cool, or oh no, they were terrible, they were slave owners, whatever. What we talked about today is actual history. The rest is completely worthlessness, and nobody should lose any time with it. Right? If you encounter any person that is just expressing a judgment over such topics in these terms, if you take my example, I completely don't consider this person. I actually, if I'm forced to confrontation, express contempt in the face of this person. And I don't see this person again because people are low and vile and cowardly. It's extremely easy, just the way I framed this topic. I'm not even, as you know, I'm not even an antiquist myself. I'm not a Latinist. I'm just a humble medievalist. But maybe I know how to frame a historical topic, and believe me, it doesn't take too much if you actually know what history is, even from the rudiments of the first years of university. At least you should. Unfortunately, we live in a world which we have given too much importance to people. This is the greatest mistake that we could do. There is a balance. It's not that you shouldn't give an importance to people, but we have started from the presumption that everything that a person says is relevant. No. Right? It may, in absolute terms, be relevant in the sense that it makes a difference, but it's so minimal that it's virtually irrelevant, as we've said before. And we have probably stopped looking at hierarchy, value, power, authority. History itself is not a passive mechanical quoting, as most people also on YouTube sometimes asking for for bibliography. I think today I exhausted your curiosities because it's the type of video in which I'm objectively forced to speak about the individual sources to make my point. There is nothing difficult to do it. You simply quote them, you cite them. That's it. It's that easy. There is nothing to do with it. But we should stop thinking that this is the way of proceeding. I'm not here to own anyone. I'm simply showing sun melting snow, that there is not even a problem, right? And why? Because I have some analytical and critical skill, and I can't simply find the evidence, providing it to you, and that's it. But most people will never reach even the end of this video because they think in advance, without knowing, that I am doing who knows what, that I'm either an extremist in the entire spectrum, that more specifically in this case, because I will frame the video in a particular way, of course I'm a suprematist of some sort, and of course I want to provoke people. Like, I'm not here to say, oh no, I'm sorry, I don't give a shit about people. I don't know if you noticed, that's how I uploaded 2,200 videos on YouTube, and that's how I just go. Right? If something is useless to me, I don't see why I should consider it. I just learn history and I go straight ahead, and whoever is in between me and that gets down. Right? That's the point. There is no way to succeed positively, morally, and scientifically without doing this. You have to understand that if a person is worthy, you have to appreciate them. I appreciate my followers. I appreciate even people who disagree with me. I appreciate anyone who's contributing to this, but only in the measure in which, of course, I'm doing this for whoever wants to understand, but the rest is completely, it does not exist. It is valid in every aspect. I hear about determinate people in my life, and that's it. I have a broader responsibility, of course, care for the collective at some degree, that however must instruct others. That's how I'm balanced. I'm balanced to be the chastiser. I'm not definitely the pleaser type of person. I have an incredibly low a lack of agreeableness in my characters and indicators, and that's it. And the point that I make with this video, I think it's useful for anyone who wants to just even have, for example, the sources at hand, wants to simply appreciate these pieces of Latin literature, by the way, that inexplicably, you see, if people were literate, they wouldn't even say things like, oh my god, this is a suprematistic thing. It has nothing to do with that. It's Romano-Italic history, pure and simple, right? And actually also a big deal, because what is expressed in these works is as clear really as possible in the straightforwardness of the concept. It is very heavy, it's very punchy, it's very strong, just like the Romans wanted, right? So let's start recovering romanity for what it was, not for what other people want it to be, that nobody should never care about, should ever care about for any reason whatsoever. History is more important than people. You should understand this very clearly, right? People pass, history remains. And what has happened makes the difference for people who want to make the difference as well in the world while they have the chance, right? Of course, an Ara Pacis is much more important than many people. There is no doubt. Is there any doubt about this? I don't know. You tell me. But in any case, I'm not provocatory by chance. I am literally telling you, look, that this is real stuff, and you've been removed from the awareness that this even existed. and you should do something about it. Seriously and quickly, right? Because the world doesn't wait for you. Also, when we consider these topics, you should always point out that you should have an adequate competence. If anything, like the tools to read Latin or to cite whatever are the easiest to get, right? At least there are ways that even like a layman can use to cite his content. The increasing problem that I actually realized from my history channel on YouTube is that people do not have any historical background, educational literacy whatsoever. We should stop flattering ourselves. Having spent your life on the internet looking at pseudo-historical stuff doesn't give you any aforementioned relevance whatsoever in this discipline. If even you have a degree in history, it doesn't mean that you actually understand how it works. Or at least you should, but let's be honest on the quality of teaching in the first place. Certain things should be learned from school. Some people do successfully, some other people don't have the palest idea of it, even though they are allegedly passionate about history for a lifetime, which they do not learn absolutely anything from it. They don't understand it. They do not know what it is to study, to learn, to actually get what is being told. Check out the Latin etymology of the word intelligence, since we shall start really recovering the meaning of our ancient language, the one of the fathers, that had very specific ways of telling things, and for a very specific reason, as we've seen today, how you can't simply read an ancient text as if it was today's one. You have to understand the subtleties, but also as far as the essential, right? You must have a background to contextualize it. Otherwise, you can do whatever with that. Again, I still haven't heard a single YouTuber ever talking correctly about this stuff. I'm waiting to be challenged by anyone. It's not that I'm looking forward to video responses or whatever, but I've never done it. Actually, if anything, it's me was been chasing others just to get a bit more views, but also because I really care. Primarily, I did it like on 2,200 videos like twice, so I'm definitely not out there for it. But let's say it's not that I'm not in for a challenge. It's that literally I don't see in the landscape, and this is very disheartening of YouTube in general. All these videos about history and all these views of bigger channels, and then you read the comments, you look around, you realize there's not even a person making like some sensible historical commentary, some sort. I mean, interacting with a channel for appreciation is something, that displaying an actual historical culture, intelligence, and education is something extremely different that I have stopped seeing even among the sort of formally trained historians. And I am from within the system. So, and I can tell you indeed that I've learned much more on my own than I did in what was for 3 years in a row the top-ranked humanistic faculty in the world after I got my doctorate. So that I don't think that we are here particularly, we're joking here. Here we're talking about very serious things, because the way you see the Romans is the way you see the world. There is no God outside of Rome. In any physical or metaphysical dimension, you can get through the meaning of existence, the universe and yourself without Rome. By definition, you're not owed an explanation. It doesn't matter what you think about it, right? Study the doctrine of the two natures and you understand that. And I like to be that brutal because this is what a video like this also should be about. I mean, actually being too kind and sort of explanatory, and that's why I'm venting all the brutality at the end of the video now. But seriously, that I appreciate very much your support. I appreciate your your interest. I know that many of you actually have historical integrity, and so I'm not referring first to my following that has reached now the size of we're talking about maybe the Gallic army at the Battle of Telamon or something like that. In any case, this is it. We will keep talking about these topics, of course, in the future. I hope this video to be some sort of path opener for further stuff and to properly, in fact, found all a series on this topic, the Italic migration. It would be so much actually to say about properly the beginning of the story, like, because we know a few about the migrations, as you know, in general. The Indo-Europeans, it's all very obscure because of the lack of written sources on, let's say, this all happened in times and places in history that couldn't, even by the neighboring peoples, like, tell us much really about the topic. But there are ways to understand this through our own countries. Right, this defeatism of saying, for example, everything that corresponds vaguely to there was a continuity between us and people living 2,000 years ago, and now it's far right, it's racism, it's white supremacy. No, it's basically what the entire, again, so-called, I hate the term, mainstream academic evidence shows us. Actually, it was a phase in which they tried to rebut, and now it's coming back even more solidly than before, so because it haven't never waned, because literally the few things we know are unequivocal regarding the essentials of what was going on. So again, I don't see much of an escape route. On the contrary, I see a chance, if anything, to understand who you are through this stuff and going ahead with a better life. I think this is very important for anyone. Very well, however, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.